Homage to the Triple Gem. So I was asked a question, I think about a week ago or so, maybe a couple of weeks ago, about the perception of impermanence. So this is the question. While practicing, I believe I can sometimes glimpse the impermanent nature of all determinations. For example, I can establish my mind on the impermanence of the breath and recognize that the breath depends on the body as its necessary basis, which is in itself also determined by consciousness and thus also impermanent and not worth holding on to. This principle can be extended to everything in experience, like the aggregates and sense domains. What would be the reason that this is still something I need to cultivate in order to recognize? When I stop the contemplation, it seems like the mind hasn't fully understood this principle of impermanence thoroughly enough, so that it cannot be seen in any other way any longer. Would you say this is just a matter of continued effort and repetition, so that at some point the mind will understand this principle, all determinations are impermanent? Or would you say that establishing the mind on this thoroughly for only one sit could be enough if this understanding sinks deep enough? So, one of the important things to recognize about the perception of impermanence and cultivating it as a meditation topic is that we're not cultivating it so that when we go out into the world and look at things that we per se see impermanence in everything. And then that is going to be like a sign that we're at a very high level of meditation. We do try to do this. I mean, we do try to cultivate this perception so it becomes a background perception, but it has a higher goal than just seeing the world in a particular way, which is to develop dispassion. So, in cultivating the perception of impermanence, it should be affecting the levels of passion towards things that are causing one to suffer. So generally one doesn't cultivate these meditation topics just like in isolation. Like one usually wants to have an idea of what it is that, what the main defilements are in one's mind and what the good qualities are in one's mind. So that we can see if we start to cultivate this perception of impermanence, is it reducing the defilements? One of the key principles actually of meditation practice is that when one really looks at what it is that causes one to suffer, it's always linked to something that one likes. And so that thing that one likes, one should imply the perception of impermanence to that. And if it reduces one's attachment to it, if it reduces one's reliance on it, then that means that the contemplation has been successful. There's a couple of different ways that one tends to need to do this. On the one hand, one needs to do it regularly, putting forth effort in cultivating the perception of impermanence towards this object that one is really attached to and that's causing one a lot of suffering. One needs to do that as a regular practice so that it becomes a kind of a background perception. But then there's also times when that particular attachment will flare up and one needs to really get into that perception, that cultivation of impermanence at that time. So, was chatting actually just the other day, just yesterday with a gentleman. We're talking about body contemplation practice. And what he'd said was that, he'd heard that it's important to be cultivating this when you're not feeling lustful, when you're not feeling attached to the body, because it will create a background perception which will overlay itself onto images that you see of other people's beautiful bodies, etc. And that will stop the lust from arising even in the first place. So there's a partial correctness to that kind of line of thinking, in that you do have to cultivate perceptions like the perception of impermanence, or in this case, a subha kammatthana, when you're not feeling lustful, when you're not feeling attached to the thing. And this will give the mind a kind of, again, a background perception that should arise when the dangerous situation, the lustful situation, the attached situation comes into one's life. Then that perception should be there already. However, just doing this is not going to be enough to stop, lust from arising forever, or not going to be enough to stop impermanence from arising, one's attachment to various things, various people from arising forever, just because you're doing it as a regular meditation topic. These are generally very strong, very deep attachments. So one needs to apply that perception in almost a hand-to-hand combat mode when it arises. And what that will do is it will change the decisions that one makes. So with the example of chatting with the gentleman yesterday about lust with regards to the body, one will be applying this perception of the foulness of the body, especially when one isn't feeling lustful, one isn't feeling really great about one's own body. But then when the rubber really hits the road is, say, when one looks at one's body and thinks, oh, my muscles are getting smaller, I better do some more working out to get bigger muscles. And there's no health need for it. It's purely a cosmetic thing. I mean, it's at that time, if one can successfully apply this perception of asubha and then make a different decision, not to take the protein powder, not to go hit the gym and do bicep curls just for the sake of getting bigger biceps, but instead to take a decision to take food just for fun, or not for fun, not for pleasure, not for fattening, not for beautification, only for the maintenance and nourishment of the body. If one can make a decision like that at that time, when lust for one's own body is arising, that will change the habit that's in the mind and gradually begin to erode the desire and passion for the body. So it's not necessarily going to be the case that you're just looking at bodies, you're seeing skeletons everywhere, although sometimes people may see that. It's when you can cultivate these perceptions in such a way that it leads you to the ability to make decisions that will undermine the habit that's causing this desire to arise again and again. That's when you're becoming successful in your meditation. So for the perception of impermanence, there's usually nodes in people's lives. You can say like these kind of nodes or focal points in people's life where a lot of their desires are centered. If one is married, it's probably one's wife and kids. Might be one's job. Like there's just these standard things in a normal lay life that are centers and focuses of desire. And so if one notices that one's continually worrying about one's job, one's continually worrying about one's spouse or husband or wife, one's continually worrying about one's kids, it's then that one needs to apply the perception of impermanence and to those objects. One wants to apply it to these objects that one likes, that one cares about, that one's passionate about, when the passion for them is not arising, when the worry for them is not arising, and then be engaged in this kind of hand-to-hand combat when it does arise. Now what that will do is it tends to separate the mind from these things that one really likes, that one really craves for, that actually give meaning to one's life. And it's when one can start to make different decisions with regards to these things that are the building blocks of one's life, that the perception of impermanence can really start to take root. It can start to spread, and it can start to do its work of undermining desire. So it's not just for the sake of like seeing one's wife or kids or job as impermanent and then that spreading to everything. It's actually for stopping the habits that one has towards them, because it's those habits that are essentially causing suffering. And it's the suffering comes usually when, as a result of the times of joy, as a result of the times of elation, as a result of the times when one is most invested, most involved in these central nodes of one's life. It's because one has developed the joy towards them that when things change, one suffers. So where one needs to look with the cultivation of impermanence is not necessarily to this like broader view, it's to the things in one's life that one is really attached to, and then applying the perception to those. If, when one's worried about one's kids excessively and unreasonably, one can apply this perception of impermanence and then make a decision that's not based on worry. I mean, if one's a parent, one has responsibilities to one's kids. I mean, you just kind of let that responsibility go. But you can make decisions that are more and more in line with the Dhamma. Then this is something that will allow that perception of impermanence to take root. Because the perception of impermanence isn't just something where you're like seeing stuff all around. It's like, okay, this is impermanent, that's impermanent, that's impermanent. What it can do if it penetrates deeply is that dispassion that one will feel towards the central nodes in one's life, towards one's wife, towards one's kids, towards one's job. When dispassion for these things starts to set in, when one starts to notice how liking and desiring these things leads to suffering, then it spreads from these central nodes it can spread to everything. Well, I mean, if this is the case with my wife, with my kids, with these central pillars of my life, what about everything else in my life? Not as an intellectual proposition, but as dispassion that spreads as a result of one cultivating habits that undermine this continual reinforcement of desire towards these things. So if this grows great enough, if this dispassion towards these things grows great enough, if one's successful in wearing away the habits that lead one to keep reattaching to them well enough, then it can start to build to a point where one sees basically all of life this way. And kind of all of life is impermanent. All of life is suffering. All of life, everything that one might attach to is not self. And it's not necessarily like one has to be cultivating the three characteristics. It's more like this passion will set in. And then wherever one looks, it's just not worth clinging to. So there's a phrase in the canon where the Buddha says it's not by rushing forward, it's not by kind of going backwards, also basically essentially not by standing still. I remember the quote correctly, that he crossed the flood. So when you cultivate this perception, you develop this passion in this way, when you look to the future has nothing in it that's worth holding to. When you look back to your past, then everything in the past seems irrelevant, and also there's nothing to cling to in the present. And if you can cultivate the perception to this degree, where your desire for something better than what's impermanent is greater than your desire for life, and your fear of the pain of suffering is greater than your fear of death, then that can be a mind state that's quite conducive to going beyond life and death in ways that are more stable, in ways that are more permanent. So in terms of the cultivation of this perception of impermanence, don't worry if it's showing up all the time whenever you look at something. Worry about whether or not your passion and desire for the central nodes in your life that are causing you to suffer is being reduced. And in terms of it spreading to everything, that's the type of thing that can happen naturally as a result of the undermining of desire towards these central pillars in one's life. Because actually the cause of death is life. So if one wants to go beyond death, one also has to go beyond life. And the reason that people keep getting reborn, keep coming back to life, is because they think it's worthwhile because of these central things. So apply the perception of impermanence there. Apply it to the things that one loves the most, but that also cause one to suffer the most. What one notices, where one notices one's suffering is. Because it's in these areas, if one attacks them, that the perception of impermanence can penetrate the deepest and can give the best results.